the lessons we learn from Lenin is that the defeat of our own imperialist powers, in this case, the Zionist proxy of U.S. imperialism in Israel, is a victory for the working class. And that the Palestinian people fighting for liberation are our natural allies because we're fighting the same enemy, U.S. imperialism.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and we have a little bit of an unusual episode today. Over the last couple of years since we've been recording Fight Back Radio, we've had as guests some of the best activists and organizers in the entire United States. And today we're having an activist and organizer, but he's going to focus not on his work as an activist and organizer, but a little bit more on the theoretical piece of this. And his name is Josh Sykes, and he's written a book, which I'm holding up now for those of you on YouTube, called The Revolutionary Science of Marxism-Leninism. And in his words, it's a handbook for organizers and our activists on theory. It condenses the scores of volumes of Marx and Lenin into a few understandable points, and he's going to cover a few of them today. Obviously, I'm condensing it even further. And the idea here isn't that you'll listen to this episode and know everything about Marxism-Leninism, but you'll get a little bit of an overview of what it is, what socialism is, and how it applies to some of the work that's being done, the activism that's being done for justice around the country and around the globe. So hopefully you'll enjoy this. Please give us feedback. I'm very interested in whether people would like to see more episodes like this, or if this is enough, or whatever. You let us know. You can reach me at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And so, like I said, this is a little bit different than what we're used to, but I assure you, Josh Sykes has a deep roots in activism himself. He writes for Fight Back News, I'm sorry. And you can catch his articles there on theory as well. So here is Josh Sykes. Okay, so I'm here with Josh Sykes, the author of The Revolutionary Science of Marxism-Leninism. So welcome to Fight Back Radio, Josh.
Hey, thanks for having me, Richard. I've been a fan of the show since its inception, and I'm honored to be a guest.
Oh, that's fabulous. That's great. And I'm a fan of your books, too, so I'm going to be highly recommending this throughout this episode to folks and future episodes as well.
Awesome.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Josh? Who's Josh Sykes, and how did you come to write this book?
I've been around the sort of Marxist-Leninist movement, and the people's movement since I was joined Freedom Road and Students for a Democratic Society back in 2005. I came and I worked with you and the Teamsters for a little while.
Yeah.
And I've been around for a long time. I took some time away to do some personal stuff, and I've gotten back involved. And I was talking to Mick Kelly, Steph Yorick about Marxism, and then Mick just suggested that I write an article series about Marxism-Leninism. And that article series took off and was popular. Red Theory, it was called, in Fight Back, and that evolved into this book.
Okay, so and I can vouch. I remember back in the day, I think I drove you to the first refounding of the new SDS at the University of Chicago. I could be wrong about some of that, but I can also vouch for the work you did in the Teamsters, where we all worked our butt off, but you were amongst us trying to reform the Teamsters 743 in Chicago and some of the the organized crime elements and organized workers during this time. So you have your base in some real class struggle back in those days. But yeah, so that you mentioned some of the leaders of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and the editor of Fight Back newspaper, and these articles you wrote for Fight Back, which became the book that we're talking about here today, The Revolutionary Science of Marxism-Leninism. And it's, I mean, I think, I want to encourage our listeners to go back and, you can check it out in the newspaper, certainly buy the book as well. But, and you've took some more, but it's like taken some really complex, or so often, books that are very long. I think, Marx and Lenin and Engels wrote scores of books, and you've condensed a good chunk of it down into about 200 pages. So it's a good way for our listeners to get an overview of what Marxism-Leninism actually is, and to start to think about applying it, and hopefully to use it to dig deeper. But let me go back. I mean, I asked who you were, but let me ask you, who is Karl Marx? I mean, who is this guy, and why is he so significant in starting out in the 19th century, but going forward in our history?
Yeah, well, Marx and his partner Friedrich Engels were both sort of intellectuals, but also organizers and activists during the sort of early development of capitalism. They were involved in the revolutionary upsurge that swept over Europe in 1848. Engels even fought in those revolutionary struggles. Marx and Engels, and Marx in particular, became leaders of the first International Workingmen's Association. And what they did that was of particular importance is they answered the needs of the working class struggle at the time to have a certain theoretical foundation that could help it push forward in the scientific way and put it on a scientific basis. And they did this by taking ideas that already existed. You had an active utopian socialist movement, particularly in France. You had British political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who were trying to understand how value was formed. And you had German philosophy coming up with an idea of dialectical change through internal contradictions between things in the form of Hegel's philosophy. And Marx and Engels took these three different things and systematized it and reshaped it in a scientific way into philosophy and science that could answer the needs of the class struggle at the time.
Okay, let's dig into that a little bit then. So, well, first, I mean, I want to take note that these were, clearly, brilliant guys who studied hard, but they were activists too. They were people that were, often people think of, or hear about Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, and they think about guys that are, teaching at the university or whatever. Often they taught in bar rooms or places like that, but they also, organized. They were writers, and the radical writers, and organized people, in the French, Paris Commune times, and in Belgium, and different things during all these revolutions from 1848 going forward. And so they were a product of their own time as well. So let's break it down though. So it's like people talk about they took the best of German philosophy, French socialism, and British political economy. Maybe we could break those down a little bit. So in the philosophy, people often don't think about as a workers kind of thing, or it's just religion or whatever. But what was the philosophy of Karl Marx and Fred Engels? You mentioned Hegel. Could you just break it down a little bit about what kinds of things that they thought about that were different than people that came before them?
Sure. It's sort of tough to get at Marx's philosophy. It's sort of inherent in his work. You find it. He just uses it, right? He never spells out a dialectical system in a real way. Engels does a little later in Anti-Düring and especially. But Marx just kind of does it and doesn't really say what he's doing. But the gist of it is that you have, if you start with Hegel, the real simple version is that Hegel has an idea that Hegel's like a religious philosopher through and through. And for him, he wants to say that there's this like saying that like hippies say all the time, where they say that like we are the universe experiencing itself, right? That's what Hegel thought, basically. That like the absolute spirit existed out there, and then there's like human history is its self-actualization or self-realization as it becomes, it develops towards truth and reality, which is then like manifested in history as the German state for Hegel. He's completely reactionary, but it's an idealist philosophy where the idea is that you still have things that are history is developing through contradictions, but the contradictions are coming from spirit, from like a religious realm, and from ideas. And it's mainly that like the ideas of great men in conflict with each other that are like driving history forward. And Marx says that's not a good way to look at it. There's something there. He calls it the rational kernel of Hegel's philosophy, which is contradiction. He says that's real. Contradiction is what's driving things forward, but it's not ideas. What matters and what is important is the way we, reproduce material reality, mainly how we find food, how we find shelter, how we build tools to work with. And he develops an idea of historical materialism that is based on the idea that like through a historical process, we get to higher and higher stages of the productive forces through their own conflict with the relations of production, which is the class relations of society, the way that we have organized ownership, right? And that
these ideas of philosophy that he has that came from Hegel, the dialectics, and actually lead right into some of what we're going to talk about in a minute here, is political economy and his socialism as well, because it starts if you try to look at history and look at how that evolves, this materialist concept of history that you're talking about, that gets you into starting to think about economics and socialism. Am I right?
Yeah, there's really like two parts of what Marx is doing here philosophically in the dialectic. There's dialectical materialism and there's historical materialism. And dialectical materialism is the underlying philosophy that is that material processes in contradiction with each other drive history forward. And then if you apply that to history and to political economy, then that's historical materialism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. But let's back up to the first one first. So Hegel was not, driving it to a materialist point of view, right? He was, had idealist, ideas. And so how is that? They're both trying to use this concept of a dialectic. Could you talk a little bit about? I know this is somewhat complicated, but can you talk a little bit about how dialectics work, or what that is, and why it's different to be looked at from an idealist perspective as opposed to a materialist one?
Yeah, let's start with materialism and idealism, and then we'll talk about the dialectic and how it relates. So a lot of people have an idea that like idealism means we're like high-minded people who want to like live in a better world. We're idealistic, right? And then a materialist is someone who's concerned with material gain and self-interest. Like that's the common everyday understanding of those terms. But philosophically, what we're talking about is what really what's primary, being or thought. And for idealists, it's thought and ideas that drive things forward and are the like motivating factor. And for materialists, it's our material being, our material reality that drives things forward. And we can be high-minded people who want a better world and who aren't driven by material like gain and be a materialist, right? To be a materialist just means that, you know, we're interested in like a down-to-earth scientific view of nature and the world. There was also an idea that developed out of materialism that was mechanical materialism, which is the materialism that developed out of people like Newton and Descartes and folks like that who had an idea that yeah, we're materialists, but everything works like clockwork. Everything fits in its own little particular place. Nothing is there. It's very neat and tidy, right? And dialectical materialism says, well, no, it's not neat and tidy at all. Everything is interrelated, interconnected. There are deep conflicts between and amongst these things, and that we can't really understand material reality unless we understand these interconnections and contradictions that are inherent in material reality.
Okay, so then, well, let me pull it forward then, though. So then, this takes us to the next concept you said, which was historical materialism.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have this view that, and I know some for our listeners, some of this is a little bit complicated. I strongly encourage you to get Josh's book where he'll break some of this down. You can take it at a pace that's good for you. And then also, you know, look at some of the places that he cites for deeper reading on dialectical and historical materialism, because these are important concepts to have, I think, in terms of trying to figure out the world and figuring out our struggles as people trying to fight for justice in the world. Just to be doing it any old way won't be as effective as to look at things the way they really are. So with that, let me circle back and ask you, you know, how does about historical materialism and why that's significant?
Yeah, historical materialism is where Marx and Engels give their like it's the foundation for their like scientific analysis of society. Marx talks about it in terms of modes of production, right? He says that different points in history are characterized primarily by these modes of production, the way we produce and reproduce our like livelihoods, right? How we work, how we organize our society around production, so that we can have food and roads and buildings and all the things that we need to live, shelter, all that stuff, right? And the gist of it is that within any mode of production, there's a contradiction between two main things, which are the forces of production on the one hand and the relations of production on the other hand. And the forces of production are things like the factories, your tools, techniques of labor, all those things that we use to build and shape what we need. And then the relations of production then are mainly relationships of ownership and power. And this is who owns the tools, who owns the land, and in capitalism, who owns your labor and labor time, and who gets to decide how those are used, and then who gets to decide how the products are distributed. And what Marx then determined was that if we look at the history of different modes of production, and he lists a bunch. He's like, there's like in pre-capitalist society, there's this communal, they're like communal societies, early form of communism in a way. And then there are these ancient slave societies, and then those give way to the feudal mode of production that we see in particularly in medieval Europe. And then that out of that develops capitalism. And he says that whenever you have one changing into another, you have an epoch of social revolution. And the reason for that epoch of social revolution is because of this conflict between the forces of production and the relations of production. And what happens is the relations of production, these relationships of ownership and power, become fetters, chains that hold back the development of the productive forces and they create stagnation, economic decline, and crisis, right? And these crises then drive forward the need for revolution, which is what ushers in the change in the relations of production, the social relations that allow new productive forces to move forward and a new mode of production to exist. That's the gist of it. So that's historical materialism in a nutshell.
Well, let me try this then. Marx famously said all human history is a history of class struggle. And so this is what you're saying is that this happens all the time, this class struggle between the ruling elites and the rest. But there's also historical materialism is like, where are the productive forces actually at? How far along in process are they? Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, the ruling classes pass their prime or whatever, and they start to decay, and they stand in the way of the next society, and it's this class struggle that casts them aside, and
exactly,
sets the conditions for a new world.
Yeah, the advancement of the productive forces. What the productive forces do for us is they eliminate scarcity, right? So, like, if you look at the ancient slave societies, it took more work to produce less because the technology, the instruments, the tools, the machines weren't as advanced as in feudal society. But the people who owned all those things and who controlled that society didn't want any of that to change. So it took for those productive forces to advance into the society that would become feudalism, into those feudal productive forces, it took upheavals and revolutions to change that. And that happened over a long period of time. It wasn't just like one and done. It was a whole epoch of social revolution that shifted and allowed feudalism to come forward. And then from feudalism, the same thing. The aristocracy and the feudal lords who controlled the grand estates of Europe, in order for capitalism to develop, it needed free labor. That is, workers who weren't tied to land, right? Serfs. Serfs are tied to land and aren't free to work for whoever they want. And for capitalism to develop in the Industrial Revolution, it needed free labor. So the demand upon that pushed things into crisis, basically, and social revolution results from that crisis. People have to overthrow that old society because the feudal lords aren't going to just step down because it's to everyone's benefit.
So Marx was Marx and his sidekick Engels, I guess, were these guys who were in Europe at that time, and where the political economy had advanced more there than anywhere else. In England, probably where capitalism became the industrial capitalism as we know it now really started out. But so they were in a place to actually see a lot of this stuff. But then they actually looked backwards and studied history very closely. and were able to put all this together and put it to use for the working class who they were working with at that time, for the people who were trying to, and they called for a socialism that was different than other socialisms at that time. There was whatever this guy Owen and Fourier and other what they called utopian socialists.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how I mean, so Marx and Engels their names are synonymous with socialism nowadays. People think, if you're some kind of socialist, you got to talk about them, even if you don't agree. But back then, they had to talk about some other guys and get their stuff up front. Can you talk a little bit about how their socialism is different than the utopian socialists?
Yeah, there were all kinds of different ideas, and it was all like, not to belittle them, because they were doing the best they could with what they had to work with in a lot of ways. The utopian socialists saw that there was inequality. They saw that there was rampant poverty, and they were like, well, certainly we can come up with a better way to run society. And that's sort of what they did. They just kind of like thought up better kinds of societies that they could run. And sometimes they tried to implement them, like Robert Owen tried to set up communes, for example, right? And what Marx did, and the importance of historical materialism and scientific socialism, the reason we call it scientific versus utopian socialism, is that he said, well, society has laws of motion that we can uncover and we can understand. These laws of motion are the laws of historical materialism, that you have contradictions that drive the change in the productive forces, and that society can't just make up new productive forces out of thin air. Like it's dependent upon the what came before it. Everything is dependent upon what came before it. You can't like skip steps. You have to find your way there. And so he was arguing against anarchists. He was arguing against these other utopians like Proudhon. And the gist of it was to say that we have to have a kind of socialism that understands, and he talks about this in the Critique of the Gotha program, especially, that understands that socialism develops out of capitalism, and it's going to bring with it some of the problems that capitalism has. And the goal of socialism, Marx talks about socialism as having two stages, a lower and a higher stage. And later, the Marxist language around that will change, and we'll talk about socialism and communism. But Marx just talked about higher and lower socialism, and that makes it a little confusing. But when he talks about the lower stage of socialism, he's talking about what we usually call the socialist state. And when he talks about the higher stage of socialism, he's talking about stateless society, communism, right? But his point is that this lower stage of socialism that has all this baggage from capitalism with it, its purpose is to systematically break apart all that baggage and all those contradictions that it carries with it from capitalism. And only by doing that, only by having a state that's controlled by the working class, can we move from this lower stage to this higher stage, communism, in a systematic and scientific way.
So what, I'm a worker here in the United States, and whatever, trudging along, got a family, whatever, and responsibilities and what all the things that all workers do. Why do I care about any of this stuff? Why should I be reading Marx or listening to reading Josh Sykes' book about Marx and Lenin? Why do we it sounds like a lot of stuff. I can just go watch a football game or something.
Yeah, you could. You should go watch the football game. It's great. But that's not. But
Maybe I will.
you might also decide that you might notice as a worker that you're working a lot. You're putting in a lot of hours. You're working hard. You're doing, maybe you're doing manual labor. Maybe you're working at a desk. In any case, you probably notice that you're working a lot harder than your boss. But for some reason, your boss has all the money. And what Marx noted was that there's been this trick that our bosses play on us, where they pretend like we're just making a deal, and I'm saying I'm going to work for you, and you're saying you're going to pay me, and everybody goes out happy. But now we're still broke, and the boss has all the money. The society around us, infrastructure is crumbling, inflation is going through the roof, the stock market crashes, whatever. There's all sorts of economic crisis, and it's not getting any better. It's only getting worse. We can't afford groceries. We can't afford rent. And what Marx is saying is that there's a reason for this, and it's a reason that we can understand, and that if we understand it, then we can organize together as a class and move from being individual workers. He says that we're a class. We move from becoming a class in itself to a class for itself, and he's carrying over some of that Hegelian language there. But what he means is we become conscious of our power as a class, and the class as a whole begins to act in its own interests. And for Marx, this meant organizing strikes and eventually revolutionary war against the ruling class.
Okay, so let me move. I mean, we're not going to cover Marx in this episode, or not all of it. We hopefully we've whetted the appetites of our people a little bit here. But I want to talk about maybe the most famous, or one of the most famous Marxists, Lenin, who's the other part of your book, and some of these ideas, Lenin and his comrades took and ran with, and they actually had a revolution. The first revolution may have been the Paris Commune, but the first one that really stuck for a period of time was the Russian Revolution in 1917. And can you talk a little bit about the terrain that the Bolsheviks were dealing with, what Lenin was dealing with? Especially I think maybe as Marx had been dead for a minute. Engels lived for much longer and wrote a number of things and played a role in the Communist International. But as we enter the 20th century and leave the 19th century, all kinds, some things, of the national question, other things were not playing out right that he noticed and started to deal with. Could you talk about, who Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was, and what do you think the most significant things during that time were that he was involved with?
Yeah, Lenin was a revolutionary in Russia. He was the founder of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which later became the Bolsheviks, later became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And he successfully led the first socialist revolution that built a lasting socialist state, the October Revolution. It happened in November, but there was a different calendar. So the October Revolution changed the way everyone thought about what was possible in the world for our class and for the enemy. It reshaped the contradictions that were taking place on a world scale It brought socialism into the world stage, created a rupture in the international capitalist system and imperialism, and changed the lives of the Russian people, and not just the Russian people, but the people of the greater Tsarist empire for the better, from its founding in 1917 until its demise in 1991. And there are, like, obviously there are ups and downs along the way, and not everything was perfect. Marx wouldn't have expected it to be. Again, you're carrying forward problems of capitalism, you're fixing those problems, you're trying to create a newer, better world. You're doing it for the first time in history, right? But before that, what Lenin took particular note of were a few things that sort of shape what Leninism is as we understand it. And that's just to kind of put them out there, and then we can break them down. He developed an analysis of imperialism as a higher stage of capitalism that sort of takes shape after Marx and Engels have their analysis isn't possible anymore. They're dead. He developed a particular theory of revolutionary organization of a particular kind of party, the party of a new type. And he developed the theory of the state. And he developed an analysis of what we call the national question, how we understand national self-determination in the era of imperialist domination. Marx knew colonialism well, right? Marx analyzed the way colonialism was an essential part of capitalism's development, but colonialism and imperialism aren't the same. Imperialism, in Lenin's analysis, is when you have, it means the same thing as monopoly capitalism, because it's when you have these big banks forming out of the merger of industrial capital, the sort of capital that fueled the Industrial Revolution, and banking capital, who are investing in these things. They're coming in, they're buying stock. They're just like, they own it in pieces, but it's just a bunch of like people who like exist off in boardrooms somewhere, right? And they're buying up all these capitalist things, and they're out of this, they're forming finance capital. And then Lenin analyzes that you have these like financial oligarchs that rise to power out of this. And then these financial oligarchs get tremendous power to control governments, resources, things like that. And because of the crises in the capitalist countries, they move not just from exporting commodities, which is what capitalism does in the colonial period, exports and imports commodities, but they start exporting capital itself, meaning they go and they put factories in places that are in a lower stage of development, into the quote unquote third world. So they start going and they divide up the world amongst themselves and amongst these imperialist powers. And because Lenin notes that imperialism develops unevenly, all these imperialist powers are at different stages of development and strength, and thus they have to fight to divide and redivide the world amongst themselves. And this is the way they resolve the crises that occur. They can't extract enough surplus value from domestic labor to keep capitalism afloat, so they go to other countries in search of super profits, even greater rates of exploitation that are possible in the third world, right? So Lenin notices that imperialism becomes this system that is taken over the whole world, but because it develops unevenly, there are these, what he calls, weak links in the chain of imperialism. Some of these imperialist powers aren't as powerful as others, and some are like barely hanging on. The Russian Empire in the like West, where Moscow and St. Petersburg are, is like a developed capitalist country, but the rest of the Tsarist Empire is very underdeveloped. It's just has like feudal mode of production, and it's not very strong. And then World War I breaks out, and Lenin puts forward this idea of like, okay, well, and there's a lot of debate in the Second International about how to respond to World War I.
The Second International is all the socialist parties and all the countries of that existed then, but Europe primarily.
Yeah, and the major figures in the Socialist International then are Germany. Karl Kautsky is the leader, and Russia. Lenin is the main representative of Russia in the Second International. And there a lot of these people in the Second International are like, well, we've got to support our country in these wars. We have to defend the fatherland, right? Because it's in the interest of the working class for us to have a strong country. That's the view that they have. And Lenin says, no, that's not right. We've always said, Marx always said, working people have no country. Workers of the world unite, all that, right? So he says, we shouldn't defend our own government, our own imperialist government in these wars. We should transform the imperialist war into a civil war. The soldiers are off fighting in Europe while we're starving at home. People are being conscripted. We've lost millions of people in this war. Everyone's starving. Let's overthrow the ruling class, the imperialist ruling class who's doing this to us. Bring the troops home, and collectivize agriculture and be able to like feed everyone. And that's what they do. They organize.
Let me back up here a little bit. So this debate between Kautsky, the German social democrat, and Lenin, who was calling himself a social democrat then, this is really the origins. Am I wrong? You go back to other Bernstein or whatever other people, but this is the origins of the differences between Marxist-Leninists and communists, like Freedom Road Socialist Organization, like Josh Sykes, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, democratic socialists and some of the social democratic or socialist parties of Europe that are running for office, or the Democratic Socialists of America, like that kind of grouping. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's right. It's one of the differences. The Social Democrats, that's what we call them now, and that's distinct from the kind of social democrat that is the term that everyone used at the time, including Lenin. When Lenin founded the Communist International, the Third International, he did so because he thought the term social democrat was wasted. It was gone. We couldn't use it anymore because these revisionists had ruined it. Bernstein and Kautsky in particular. But they had a couple of ideas that were competing for worst ideas amongst them. One was this sort of we can have socialism at the expense of the rest of the world thing. We can if we plunder the third world, we can use that to fund our own socialism. So that was sort of the idea behind the Second International defense of the fatherland view. And then they also had an idea, Bernstein championed in particular, which was just this purely reformist path to socialism, that we're going to stand for office and we're just going to be elected to socialism. If we can just change the heads of the government, we can change the mode of production through it. Those are two sort of bad ideas that they had that were competing for which one could be worse.
I want to get into Lenin's ideas about organization in the state, but before I do, I want to touch a little bit on the national question, which is the other thing you said. We've had a number of people on Fight Back Radio that have talked about the Black national question here in the United States. Frank Chapman, who's also an author, is on here talking about it extensively. And this also has its origins in, Lenin's thinking. I should maybe not its origins, but it certainly he advanced it. Could you talk a little bit about Lenin and the national question and what he saw in that, and then maybe a little bit about how that would relate to modern day situations, maybe Palestine or Black Americans?
Yeah, Lenin noted that there was a period in history when the capitalist ruling class, the bourgeoisie, was coming to power, when the capitalist nation states were formed through the sort of overthrow of feudalism. But then the process of imperialist domination then comes to they colonize other countries, and then they start exporting capital to these other countries and form neo-colonies, what he calls semi-colonies, and things like that. And that these countries never have an opportunity to develop into proper nations in the same sense that the countries at the dawn of capitalism did, like Germany, for example. And they're being oppressed by these imperialist powers. And that this oppression is hampering their development in terms of culture, language, economy, all these things that sort of are defining characteristics of what a nation is, aren't really able to fully develop. They just sort of partially develop to the point that you're able to tell that these distinct oppressed nations are there, but they're oppressed, right? They're unable to actualize themselves. And that's not possible until imperialism is overthrown. Until that point, imperialism is going to continue to export capital to these countries. It's going to continue to try to dominate their governments. It's going to continue to try to dominate all their political systems. It's going to extract surplus value from their economies. And in the case of Russia, these nations exist within the Russian Empire. So Lenin calls Russia a prison house of nations, right? There are hundreds of oppressed nationalities in Russia, oppressed nations where people of different nationalities are held under the boot of great Russian chauvinism and Russian imperialism.
So you're talking about Mongolia, Azerbaijan, Georgia,
yeah, exactly.
Lithuania, whatever. All those kind of different nationalities are part of Russia at that time.
Right, and they're being held back and held down and super exploited by the Russian Empire and the Tsar. And what Lenin's insight is that Marxism traditionally has always had this working men have no countries, workers the world unite thing. But he says that imperialism sort of changes this dynamic a little bit, and the nationalism of oppressed nations becomes progressive, right? That communists and socialists have to unite with these nationalist aspirations, because these nationalist aspirations, these countries are anti-imperialists inherently. They can't help but be, right? They might have their own reactionary strands among them and things like that, and they're not like socialists, but by being anti-imperialists, they're a strategic ally of the working class, and the working class should unite with and support these people. He also notes in relation to Russia that in order to unite to overthrow the Russian capitalists, the monopoly capitalists, and the Tsar, to unite with those oppressed nationality people, predominantly peasants, is essential. And to do that, you can't carry over into socialism the oppression that existed previously. He talks about national self-determination. He says we have to support the right of all these nations to determine their own fate, which means ultimately, and there's no other way of looking at it, the right to territorially secede, to political and territorial independence. But he says we're not advocating that. That's not what we're saying they should do. We're not dictating anything to these oppressed nations. We're saying they have the right to do this, and he compares it to the right to divorce. He says that you can only have a marriage that where you're really equals if the right to divorce exists, right? No one can be forced to stay there. So by having this right to divorce, or this right to self-determination in this case, you give the possibility of like, okay, well, we're going to form a stronger union and a stronger, we're going to work together as equals and not as an oppressor and an oppressed nation.
So how do these ideas of Lenin's, how do they help us if we're trying to look at, for example, what's going on in Palestine right now?
We look at Palestine as a very clear example of such national oppression. So in Palestine, you have the imperialist interest, starting with England with the Balfour Declaration, and then the sort of Palestinian mandate, and then in 1948 you have the formation of Israel, which is done by like the imperialist powers who bring Zionist settlers to Israel to work as like a proxy of imperialist powers in the Middle East. As they do this, at first, Jews and Arabs live together peacefully until the Nakba, the great Palestinian catastrophe where the Zionists ethnically cleanse thousands of Palestinian people. And then the state of Israel is formed as a Jewish state, where Palestinian people, Arabs, become second-class citizens in the same sense as apartheid South Africa, right? It becomes an apartheid state. They're more and more separated into smaller and smaller restricted Palestinian zones, the West Bank and Gaza, and their rights are curtailed throughout the country. So you have this oppressed nation in Palestine that naturally and very reasonably yearns for liberation. And on October 7th, we saw the unified Palestinian resistance take up arms against the Zionist settlers and the Zionist state, and fight and start to win that liberation. So what the lessons we learned from Lenin is that the defeat of our own imperialist powers, in this case, the Zionist proxy of U.S. imperialism in Israel, is a victory for the working class. And that the Palestinian people fighting for liberation are our natural allies because we're fighting the same enemy, U.S. imperialism. It's U.S. imperialism that funds Israel, and they do this so that they can have a powerful military force to do their dirty work in the Middle East while they are able to like keep some distance.
Okay. So let me ask you then, I want to pivot a little bit because, and I know we're running through lots of stuff in a quick time here. But hopefully, as I said earlier, I hope we're whetting the appetite of our listeners to go out and actually check out some of these deeper issues. But Lenin also he talked about a party of a new type. You mentioned Bernstein earlier, who was talking about we need to vote people in.
Yeah.
And in Germany, that was starting to happen. I think at that time they were having success in elections, and people were getting elected to office. And that happens here and there now and again. But the success wasn't translating into power for working class people.
Yeah.
And Lenin said we need a party of a new type, a party to build a revolution. Could you talk a little bit about Lenin's ideas and how they departed from maybe some of the people in the Second International, and what was groundbreaking about it as well?
Yeah, look, the German Social Democratic Party was huge. It was an enormous party. Millions of workers were in this party. They had culture. They had like huge cultural events. Like if you went to the pub, or you went to like the theater or whatever, it was a Social Democratic Party event, right? They like all of the like German working class was organized into this party. But this is also the party that eventually united with the fascists to kill Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. This party, who
were leading radicals and revolutionaries in the German working class. So
yeah, they struggled to prevent revolution. They acted as the left wing of reaction in in Germany by the end, and all of it, like as big as they were, it didn't do any good because it wasn't a fighting organization that was contending for state power, to put the working class in state power. Like Lenin says that you can't just lay hold of the existing capitalist state machinery. You have to smash it. Then you have to rebuild a new state, what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means to say that every state, according to Lenin, is a dictatorship of one class over the other. Capitalist society is like that. Our society is like that. It's a dictatorship of the capitalists, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and it exists to oppress working people.
So instead of the rich people running the show, we don't want to just take over their show. We want to smash it and create a show where the working class runs the show.
Right.
Is that right?
We want to reorganize society based on the needs of the working class. And in order to do that, we can't expect to just win elections and for them to just be like, well, okay, well, we're socialists now. That's not going to work. And Lenin got resistance to this idea, not only from the Second International, but from his own party too, from the Mensheviks, who said, look, having a mass socialist party with millions of people in it seems awesome. Let's do that. We can make progress in elections. We can win reforms, and through these reforms, we can get real meaningful change for working people. And they said, Lenin, you just want to like form this little tight group that's not capable of organizing the sort of mass revolution that you want anyway. And Lenin had this great analogy in his book, What Is to Be Done, which is the main book where he outlines this idea of the party of the new type, where he talks about this swamp, right? And he says, okay, well, imagine that we're going through this swamp together, and all around us are enemies who want to destroy us. The swamp is filled with terrible creatures that are like trying to eat us. And you're saying that we are making a mistake for being in this tight-knit, well-organized group that's purpose is to like move us safely and securely through this swamp. And that to Lenin was what this party was. And he said, like, if you want to go into the swamp, go ahead, but don't take us with you. We're going to do this. And this thus resulting in the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. But his idea was that we needed a party that would act as the leaders of the proletarian army. That's the way that Stalin later put it. the cadres of the party are the leaders of the proletarian army. That these people are the ones who are going to be the vanguard, the leading tip of this like fighting force that's able to organize both legally and illegally in order to do what needs to be done to take power and to build a new socialist state. And this party then, as the party of the working class, would then come to lead that new socialist state and organize socialism.
Okay, so I mean, there's a lot here, and maybe we're going to have to invite you back to talk about some of it. But I want to ask you about two guys, two famous, political leaders who called themselves socialists, and get your reaction to them in line with this idea of Marxism-Leninism that you line up in your book, The Revolutionary Science of Marxism-Leninism. And the first one is Leon Trotsky. What's your take on him? Many people that are followers of Trotsky will say they're Marxist, they're Leninists as well. And I know you disagree with that. Could you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are about Trotsky and his writings and his movement?
Well, I'll say if you want to get in deep with it beyond what I'm going to say here, that I wrote a whole series of articles about Trotskyism that you can read on Fight Back News. If you'll just search for against Trotskyism, so that's a spoiler. That's how I feel about it. But no, I don't think that Trotsky was ever a Leninist, and I think that there are countless points of sharp disagreement between Trotsky and Lenin while Lenin was alive, before and after the revolution. The sort of cornerstones of Trotskyism don't line up with Leninism, but it's like, to me, the big difference where you can really like see how it pans out is organizational. Like the Trotskyists have this idea of like, they named it entryism. They called it the French turn, is what they originally called it, but they also call it entryism, which is this idea that like Trotskyists will go into mass movements, and they famously did this with the Socialist Party in the United States, and try to take them over and turn them towards Trotskyism, and they have this sort of like rule or ruin approach where you take it over or you destroy it in the process of failing to take it over. And if you compare this to the Leninist method of mass organizing, which I also talk in the book, the mass line, you just see a world of difference. The mass line approach is to go to the masses of the people, get a sense of their like felt needs, and look to the advanced fighters among these masses, see what their demands are, organize and build around the demands of these advanced people, use them to like reach this like intermediate group of people who are just watching football, and see if you can bring them along, because they have the same problems. They're just not the ones who are organizing, but we can bring them in because they have the same issues. And then by doing that,
you may have started to answer my question, but the next guy I was going to ask you about was Mao Zedong. So maybe I'll just go there. So
the mass line, this mass line idea is originally formulated in this sense by Mao. The Bolsheviks used it, but like Mao systematized it and sort of gave us these categories to think about it in. But so in organizing with the advanced, you win over and bring over the intermediate, and then you sort of either win over elements of the backwards or isolate these like diehards, right, who are going to struggle against you no matter what. And in this way, you build like a genuine mass movement, right? A movement like of the masses. And the the party as it exists is too small. It's always going to be too small to like build a real revolution of millions of people. But we don't want a mass party. We want a united front that's able to unite with mass organizations, that's able to unite with oppressed nationalities, and that's able to, like, based on our shared felt needs and struggles for reforms, even lead fights that can progress further and further towards revolutionary goals. And so the goal of Marxists and of the party in this is to use revolutionary science, Marxism, to help sharpen through particular guidance these things, these like mass demands, and in a strategic way determine where the like fulcrum points are that we can direct them at to make change. And not only to make change, but through these struggles to build organization, develop mass organization and our organization, and to win over these advanced fighters to Marxism and to helping us to build the party that's needed to change the world.
Well, thank you. I mean, this has been fabulous. There's a lot there, more than maybe I knew this, but even more than I imagined as we got into it. But we're winding down on time here. But is there anything else you want to add? Any points that we have not made that you would like to make before we end the interview?
Man, I've got a lot more to say about Mao, but we don't have to get into all that. I will say that I think that as far as dialectical materialism and the way we do our analysis, Mao also made some really important contributions through On Practice and On Contradiction, which were his articles, and through his understanding of like how protracted war develops through stages. That's like applicable in particular to large peasant countries, right? But I think if you want to understand dialectical materialism, On Contradiction is very important to read, and reshaped the categories through which we understand it by understanding that the contradiction itself develops unevenly, and that there are principal contradictions, secondary contradictions. And I wish we had time to get into all that.
Well, maybe we'll have to invite you back.
Yeah. So the other thing, I just want to encourage people, you can get my book from frso.org/books. And I guess, Richard, you can put that in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the goal of the book always was to give a sort of manual of Marxism to these advanced people who are coming to us from the mass movement and are interested in what Marxism is and what socialism is and what these ideas have to offer to real practical revolutionary struggle. And the book is written in a way that I think if you find these ideas like intimidating, once you dig into the book, you're not going to feel that way. The chapters are really short. They're explained in like little digestible chunks. And I don't think that you're going to have a hard time with it. You're going to read this book, and I think everybody, from someone who's new to someone who is been thinking about these things for a long time, will have something to get from this book. So I hope that your listeners will pick it up and read it.
Yeah. So the book is The Revolutionary Science of Marxism-Leninism by Josh Sykes, and you can also find Josh on at fightbacknews.org. Which Fightback Radio is a production of. And thank you so much for being our guest. This has been wonderful. You've given us a lot to think about, Josh Sykes.
Well, it's important to think about. It really is the science of revolution, and if we're going to change society, we actually need it.
That's right. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, Richard. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so there was Josh Sykes, and as I said, that's a little bit different than what we're used to. It was a lot more on the theory side of things, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was something different. But as I said, let us know if this is something you'd like to see more of, or if we think we should go in a certain direction with theory. This is something new to us, so we're trying it out, and you're our feedback. You're our listeners. And if you liked it, or you think you know somebody else that might like it, please pass it on to them. This is how we get the word out about all the different about the Fight Back Radio episodes. And certainly send us an email or put a comment or give us 5 stars or thumbs up in the reviews section. But you can reach us if you wish at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And again, I want to thank our entire production team of Dodd McColgan, Natalie Pranis, Shane Tremley, and Vince Olson. And I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team. And until next time, saying all power to the people. Okay.
I'm like the least interesting guest you had so far, so that's nice to hear.
I don't believe that. I know better. I actually know better. I remember days. We had a lot of days in Chicago together, trucking around for the Teamsters stuff. Yep. Whatever that was good. I have very fond memories of that.
Me too.